to Diving Deeper Discussions. I'm your host, Randy Isaac, on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation and its publications, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. Today, we have as our guest Graeme Finlay. Dr. Finlay is the author of a book entitled God's Gift of Science, Theological Presuppositions Underlying Exploration of the Natural World. This was reviewed by Basil Favis, a very nice review in the March 2024 issue. And I hope many of you have been able to access the book and read it. But we're very pleased to have you with us, Graeme. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Randy, and all of you. I'm very honored to be here.
Yeah, and
you'll have to excuse my funny accent.
Oh, yeah, real funny. We enjoy it. We consider that to be an elite accent, Graeme. Graeme, well, we'll find out very soon where he's from and where he is right now. But Graeme, since I think a fair amount of our audience won't know you very well, let's take a little time to introduce you here. So first of all, yes, as you pointed out, you're probably not a native U.S. person. Where were you born and raised?
I was actually born in Singapore.
Of
Kiwi parents who had gone to Singapore as Christian missionaries to teach the gospel of Jesus. So I spent nearly all of my first 15 years there, very formative years.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was 15, my parents returned to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I must confess, I experienced a lot of culture shock at that time. On the outside, I looked like a European Kiwi. On the inside, I thought like an Asian. So I tended to sequester myself and get into scholarship in my high school years.
That is quite a transition, right? Your parents, yeah.
Yes.
Was the language much different, or is it you were multilingual, or was it all English when you grew up?
No. I learned some of the Malay in Singapore, but I never became fluent. So most of my education in Asia was in English, and I just continued that, returning to New Zealand.
Okay, excellent. So where did you get your higher education then?
Right. I guess growing up in the tropics, I became interested in creepy crawlies. So I studied biology at the University of Auckland. And I really think I followed the pathway of least resistance. Going through a bachelor's degree, I majored in cell biology and biochemistry, and then a master's degree in cell biology, and then a PhD in cell biology, particularly in cellular immunology. And then after that, I became involved in cancer research, also in Auckland. Okay,
so all of your education was University of Auckland then? So you spent your time there.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Not very brave, not very imaginative.
So that's where you did all your cancer research then, at that university? You stayed there?
Yes, that's right. The university hosted the Cancer Society Research Centre, which was run by the Cancer Society, which is clearly it's a charity, but it was housed within and partly administered by the university. So I was involved in anti-cancer drug development in the early days, and then became more involved in the biology of cancer cell lines towards the end of my time there.
Did you focus on any specific type of cancer or just cancer in general?
Well, our lab, before I joined, made a drug called amsicrin. And it was tested against leukemias and was therefore effective in human leukemias and lymphomas. So when I joined the lab, the desire was to make drugs which were effective against solid tumors. So that's a rather wide range, but solid tumors in general were our subsequent focus of interest.
Okay, that's great. Now, you told us your parents were in the mission field, right, in Singapore.
Yes,
so you clearly grew up immersed in the faith tradition, and So at some point, you must have gotten interested in fusing the two, your scientific interest and your faith.
Yes, I certainly did. I saw no conflict. Early on, I was not really involved deeply. I was somewhat concerned by the controversies which existed within the church. Um, and I tried not to be involved in that too much. I guess the change was in the late 90s, during the sequencing of the human genome. Up till that time, I was a cell biologist. Small things amuse small minds. If anything is bigger than about 20 microns, I lose interest.
Mm-hmm.
But when the genome was sequenced, then suddenly human biology and human evolution became features of a scientific field which I was very familiar with. And at that stage, I said, look, here we have a conclusive proof in biological parlance that we are an evolved species. Our genome and the chimp genomes are wholly interconvertible through very well-known mechanisms. So at that stage, I felt I just had to get out and tell my fellow Christians that there is no clash here. And I started to think more deeply and to write and publish.
Okay.
And I've been active in that area since then.
And how did you become aware of the American Scientific Affiliation and or the ISCAST in Australia? How did that come about?
Well, birds of a feather flocked together, and clearly I was interested. I came across big names, Francis Collins, of course, and other people in the ASA. We've also had links with Christians in Science in the UK, the Faraday Institute, which does a good job, very much like Biologos. So I've had lots of interest and lots of people who have strengthened and informed my faith, both from ASA and from the other Christians in Science organizations.
Okay, very good. So tell us a little bit more about how you came to write this particular book.
Well, actually, it's my fourth book, but I wrote it under lockdown. I had been given a topic to speak, which was very much like this, how Christian theology has had an input into science. And I was going to give that live to a Christian group called Thinking Matters. But then we had COVID lockdown. And I thought, well, I'm going to put this idea onto paper. I'm going to write it, or onto silica, or whatever the issue is. I had read all my life about the history and the interrelationships between Christianity and science without ever having the boldness to publish it. But having started to publish in the theology science interface, I then decided that the interface is so exciting to me as a Christian. It's so positive that I thought I'd get this down into a little book, and I would publish it through a very good American publisher, so that hopefully people would read it and people would be able to see the syllogisms which occur between Christian theology and mainstream science. I mean, these are wonderfully compatible, and I believe that they form the most satisfying worldview.
Yeah. That's great. Well, we're going to delve into your book a little bit more, but first I'd like to digress because I see the reviewer is here, Basil Favis. I think I got your name right. Yeah, let's see. Vicky, you have to let him in here. So let me just ask you briefly first, how did you come to do the review of this book?
Yeah, so, well, I have been a Christian for many years and also a professor at the University of Montreal and Department of Chemical Engineering. But my main contact with the ASA, I had heard about the ASA, but my main contact was through Chris Berger. So there's a whole group of us in the Montreal area that meet as faculty fellowship, and Chris at one point had said, I think it might be interesting for you to review this book. And I actually give public lectures on faith and science in Quebec at most of the major universities. And so at one point, Chris thought, you know what, you should probably take a look at this book. And it was a real pleasure to do it. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. pleasure to have you with us here.
Great.
So, okay, Graeme, let's return a little bit more to the our discussion here. And as is our custom here, we're going to start with the questions that were submitted in advance, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And I want to remind everyone that if you would like to make a comment or if you'd like to ask a question, look down at the bottom, one of those icons. You may have to click on more with 3 dots or whatever, but somewhere you'll find the icon or section called reaction, and click on that, and underneath reactions is a raise your hand option. If you raise your hand, I will call upon you in the order in which you raise your hand. And so this way we hope to have a little orderly discussion. But of course, we have a very faithful attendee, and Del Kuhn, who can usually be relied upon to ask the first question, as it is today. So, Del, thanks for being here again, and I'll let you ask him his question.
Hey, thanks, Randy, and thanks, Graeme. I very much enjoyed the book. I'm assuming Randy forwarded my questions, so I'll abbreviate it to the Reader's Digest version of it. Is that I wanted to pick up a little bit on chapter 4, where you make the transition from Francis Bacon using the power gained from knowledge to benefit humanity to a post-Nietzsche C.S. Lewis comment about the conquest of nature is really the conquest of one person over another using nature as the means. And a lot of us have come out of the COVID-19 situation with a very skeptical opinion of science professionals, specifically from public health. But concern is that that skepticism is going to extend to other scientific areas that are also going to impact public policy that we're going to be involved with. And I happen to think the skepticism is well earned, and I think that Lewis's comment does a very good job of encapsulating what our skepticism means about power. So I'd like to turn the question from the consumers of science, like we are, most of us are in this case, to the producers of science, and wonder what sort of people are going into science now, whether there's been a change in the last couple of generations, because these are the ones who presumably are going to be using what they gain from science as power over us. So it's kind of a variant of what I put on paper, but it's kind of where I'm going is what are we going to be looking forward to? And I think that in your book, you've kind of at least given me personally a vocabulary to evaluate what I think is going on.
Thank you. That's a hard question, but for all of my working life, I have been greatly influenced by some articles by another good Canadian, Walter Thorson. He spoke of the end of science as people move from a belief in reality, in the ontologically real world out there, to belief, to the loss of confidence in objective reality. And I think we live in a postmodern world, increasingly postmodern, where concepts of truth are becoming more and more marginalized. So you really need a sociologist of science to say what sort of people are joining science these days. I would just say that if they are people who are joining science because they have belief in an objectively real world out there, and they find it exciting and interesting and want to understand it, then that is a wholly good thing. I cannot say what proportion of young scientists are like that. I'm sure there are still many. And I think Thorson made the point of view that as postmodernism develops, we can expect to find perhaps an increasing proportion of people who believe in the objective reality of the world out there, presumably, or in many cases, because they have belief in a God of truth. On the other hand, there is this increasing tendency, and I cannot say how strong it is, of people who enter science because of the prestige, or because they want a good, stable job, or because they want to control, as you say, control nature or predict or use nature for human benefit. So I think therein lies the difficulty, the danger of the future. But to what extent it is becoming dominant, I do not know. One hopes and imagines that it is people who believe in the objectively real world out there, and therefore who retain that aspect of the Christian worldview, who will continue to make major contribution towards truly scientific advance. Obviously, science and technology, they have a very porous interface, very hard to separate them. But I think it's helpful if we think of basic science as a search to understand, and technology as a search to control and manipulate and predict and draw profit. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether that answers your question.
Yes, Del.
It's as good an answer as I could expect. I'm not in an academic setting, so I don't have a clue as to why someone is going in any particular field. I just kind of optimistic between hope for the future because it's an exciting time and think the world is going to pot. So it depends on the day. I'm more optimistic than not, but I wonder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes, well, I guess with scientists, we are all mortal. We are all sinful. And therefore, we are all contaminated by that same desire to take shortcuts, or the same weakness to take shortcuts or to manipulate things to our own ends. So, coming back to the character of God, we continually need to look at ourselves and ask ourselves whether we are acting and working in integrity.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. Okay, our first person with a raised hand is Basil.
Right. Well, first of all, Graeme, I did want to just thank you very much. It was incredibly enjoyable to read your book, and it was wonderful actually to be able to write a review, because you get pushed into the details and you have to think deeply, and it really, really got me thinking. Thank you very much for that. The question I had was related, I think, to the last question, and I thought that it was part of your book where you were poignant. You were this death of science, and I think that, to continue from the last question, that it seemed to me that the real problems of power that are associated with science that you were relating to here are often when we start to have interest groups and we start to have money involved, and you start to have power related to money, i.e. tobacco industry, i.e. the fossil fuel industry, to use your own. One could say perhaps some aspects of even possibly the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, anyone could be subject to that, right? And so that I thought was really interesting. And I thought that was kind of like a big call to all of us, to take heed. So I don't know, you want to just expand a bit on that? I thought it was very interesting.
These are very difficult issues, aren't they?
Yeah.
Because of the way society is going. When I joined the cancer lab 40 years ago, we already had a drug in the clinic. And the director of the lab, a brilliant chemist called Bruce Kane, never patented the drug. He did not think of patenting it because he wanted the drug to have maximal exposure out there. But that's a world now which no longer exists. And I know drug companies must somehow recoup their investments. But increasingly, anti-cancer drugs, which cost $100,000 for a set of treatments, are now beyond the reach of most patients. So I don't have answers here, but I think we do need to look at ourselves and say, in one working lifetime, we have moved from research as being maximally applicable to most needy people to research as being an enterprise for which financial considerations are desperately important, are perhaps the main importance. Now, I say that even though in my later years we patented everything that we produced. And I have a beloved son, that's what's brought me to the UK, who is now in medicinal research, and they patent and cover everything they produce. So there is a lack of openness. And how do we look at that when clearly research is such an expensive enterprise? So I'm really setting a question here, asking us to look at ourselves and say, what is the future of research, which was once meant to share our findings as much as we could, to a position now where our findings are secret? We've lost something. And I can't tell you how we need to go back, but there is this loss of transparency and openness and free exchange of ideas upon which science was originally based. I don't know whether you've got conclusions or suggestions as to how we as Christians can go back to that ideal openness.
Well, I like that particular chapter because I thought it was really forcing us to think about what the world of research is going to look like in the future. And I think to some degree, it seemed to me that you are also, like from a professor's point of view, making the distinction between perhaps fundamental research and applied research as well there. I mean, I really believe, in Niebuhr's, idea that when people get together in groups, they're capable of doing some pretty horrible things, and that many of these people as individuals would be, and so that's why I was thinking, like, it sort of resonated with me about interest groups, about money, and about that side of it. I would say myself in my own faculty, there are some people who obviously see their students as someone, they're just going to make those students into their image, and that is a power activity. But the vast majority are not like that. And the vast majority, and I think that might be lost on some people who are not directly involved in faculty. There are many good people. And when we hire someone, for example, one of the things we ask all about the research activity, where they want to go, blah, 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 how they're going to get funding. But we always ask why you would want to be a professor. And if we don't hear something about working with young people, about working with young adults, it's even for people who are not people of faith, there's a red light goes on. So I don't know. I have some hope in the individuals, but I'm really concerned about the money and the way funding of research can be so directional. So I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yes, I guess it's the golden rule that the person who has the gold makes the rules. But that's something that perhaps needs to be opposed when appropriate. And we need to say, this is research for the maximum number of people, for the maximum good.
Okay. Yeah, it's a tough one to solve. We've got a lot of competing factors going on. I've got a whole ton of questions. So if no one else is raising their hand, I'm going to take advantage of that. Graeme, first of all, let me back up to what the first part of your discussion in responding to Dell's question. The subtitle of your book is Presuppositions, Underlying Exploration of the Natural World. And there are a number of these that you've pointed out and that we need to discuss. But you mentioned here in the program the importance of the perception of reality, and recognizing that the universe is real and is worth studying. I agree with that, but I'd like to push back a little bit in the sense of what difference does it really make? I mean, if someone coming into science does not have that view, what difference would it really make in his science or her?
I think our presuppositions were immensely important in the early days when we did not have years of precedent to go by. I mean, these days people say, I want to do science because it works. Period.
Utilitarian. That's a utilitarian view.
Yes, it is. But for the pioneers of science, it was not obvious that it would work. And so their presuppositions, which are the unspoken ideas and thoughts which people absorb by osmosis through their childhood and as they grow up, was the biblical presuppositions which informed and motivated the early scientists. For people these days, such presuppositions are not so important because they have got centuries of success to look at and to go by.
Okay, could you be more specific there? You say these biblical presuppositions. Can you just identify which ones you think are most important?
Right. Well, I produced a few which I have read about. Obviously, none of them are original to me. They all come from historians of science and historians of ideas. But even the fact that God is almighty, which is the product of the Judeo-Christian scriptures worldview, that was not at all apparent to many people in the world. Because if you believe in a crowd of God who are conniving and capricious and who are maybe even hostile, and so the world is hostile and the world is unpredictable and capricious, then you are not going to make any progress. You're not going to start studying science. If you believe, as many of the Greek schools and some of the East Asian schools believe, that matter is very inferior, if not evil, then that is going to be a disincentive to science. But the presuppositions absorbed from the scriptures, which said that God is good, and he declared his world to be good. In fact, he declared it to be very good, and flesh is good. The human body is good. These things liberated the early scientists from decrying the world of matter. And instead, they could see it as being something worth looking at. The consistency, the faithfulness of God, as well as God's rationality, led the first scientists to really believe that laws could be discovered. And I guess this might have been fingered lightly by the ancients, but certainly it was people in a Christian environment such as Descartes and the others of the 17th century, Boyle and Newton, who were certain that laws could be discovered because they believe in a God who was rational, faithful, and consistent. And another very important presupposition was the idea that God creates freely. Therefore, the world does not have to be the way it is. In other words, the world is contingent. So we can't do what many of the Greeks did and say, let's start off with self-evident presuppositions, self-evident truths, and deduce how we should find everything else. That's rationalism, and rationalism doesn't contribute anything to science. Rather, we need to say God is free. He made the world as he wanted. The only way we can investigate this world, this contingent world, is through observation and experiment. And so the early experimentalists, by and large, were people who had faith in the God who created the world freely. So we can go on. But
well, let's stop here a little bit, because I'm just thinking, Graeme, these presuppositions, these two that you articulated just now, they were documented in the scriptures for thousands of years. Why did it take so long for science to explore that?
One of the people I comment in my book says that science is a multi-dimensional development. And scripture itself does not contain science.
Right.
It just contains the presuppositions of science. It tells us of a God whose faithfulness and goodness make science possible. And therefore, it is people of all cultures who have shown ingenuity, who have acutely observed their world, who have developed technologies, who have developed mathematics. I mean, mathematics comes from the Indians and the Mesopotamians and the Muslims, the Arabs. And so the presuppositions of science, if you like, the metaphysics of the Hebrews and the physics of the Greeks and others needed to come together before the physics of the Greeks could really take off, informed by unspoken understandings of the way the world really is. So it needed a cooperation, it needed a conjunction of unspoken metaphysical presupposition, which are biblical, and the human desire and attempt to understand and probe the world around them. So I think that's the reason why you needed these things to come together. But it certainly wasn't as late as the 15th and 16th century. Certainly in Europe, there was a great scientific tradition in the medieval ages at Oxford and Paris, as the early scientists, people like Robert Grosseteste, who became the Bishop of Lincoln, combined his Christian thought with the first experiments and speculations of the underlying structure of the way that the world really is. So Galileo and other scientists of the 16th and 17th century could look back to the precedent of the theologians of the medieval ages. So the roots of these basic understandings of reality do go back far beyond that. And of course, the theologians of the Middle Ages go back to people like John Philoponus, who was in Alexandria in the 5th century, Aristotle, a scholar who nevertheless criticized Aristotle clearly, strongly, particularly, for example, in saying, no, the stars are of different colors. They are fires, just like fires you see on Earth. They are not gods. And he was criticized roundly by some of the Greek philosophies, even as late as the 5th century. Yeah. So the roots are deeper.
So these deep roots, God's role and the notion of the reality of God, wasn't that shared with the Islam tradition as well? And to what extent did the medieval Islam community contribute to science?
They contributed greatly because, and I'm not an expert here, but clearly they shared the one conviction of one rational and faithful God, which I think is one of the most important bases to our presuppositions. But they also inherited the wonderful riches of Greek and Christian thought of those first 5 or 6 centuries. So again, it was a case of a cooperation, collaboration. And many of the early Arabic scholars were, in fact, Nestorian Christians. I understand, for example, in medicine, not all, but many. And so it was a collaborative effort.
So the presupposition that really counts here, if I understand you right, is the conviction that nature or the universe in general is real, is consistent, reliable, okay? And let's see, how do I think about this? perhaps it's more of a modern day notion because you didn't have it very much in history. But to what extent is it necessary for God to be acknowledged as a creator in order for that consistency to exist? In other words, I think today with the rise of atheism over the last century or two, we're getting more and more of a sense of underlying reality, even though its origin may not be understood and is not understood apart from God. But if we set that aside, simply the very nature of the universe as being a consistent being is what more and more people are going on, not necessarily the source of that consistency. I don't know if that's getting clear, but I mean, there are other trends coming in now, right?
Certainly there are, but I think many materialistic or atheistic scientists, if they stop to think about it, do wonder at the source of the presuppositions of science. Not the mechanics of science, they're well established. I once heard a very, very top British scientist who was visiting Auckland. And at the end of a very erudite lecture, which was at least partially over my head, he finished off by saying that he wondered at the presuppositions, the unspoken tacit presuppositions from which science developed. And in fact, I wrote him a letter that night in which I expressed what I was already convinced of, that these presuppositions, in fact, come from the Judeo-Christian worldview. Now, he never came back to me. And I have this wonderful hope that my letter was framed in his office, but I suspect not. But he was a man who had stopped to think about the issue and wondered at what metaphysical basis science was initiated. You know, the alternative is thinking of people like Professor Richard Dawkins, who was, of course, the very famous atheist, who makes all sorts of statements, but is absolutely oblivious to his presuppositions. He cannot distinguish between his atheistic metaphysic and science itself. And so I think it's very easy for people to, these days, to be unconscious of the presuppositions that they are working on the capital of previous generations and centuries. And I think we Christians need to get out and say, hey, your science is ultimately possible because we live in this kind of a universe. It is a universe which is consistent and all the rest of it. I mean, people are not aware, for example, I extensively quote Stanley Yaki in my book. And I've only got one of his books, but it's a magnificent book in which he goes through civilization after civilization, showing that those people believed in cosmic cycles. You had returns like the Stoics and other Greek schools and many other civilizations, and that weakened the idea of cause and effect. It was inhibiting of the human spirit. This endless return, these ideas of endless returns. Right. And the modern scientist never thinks that that is perhaps a default position of many ancient peoples. But because God is redeeming, he works with the arrow of history. He calls Israel. He calls his people. He sends his son. The Christian emphasis on history. Right. That's biblical. And people aren't aware of that. But their science still works, but they've forgotten that this sense of time originated with the idea of an ever-working God. Certainly it comes out very strongly, for example, in the book about the origin of geology, where the first scientists wanted to understand what these funny rocks were and the fossils they found. Mm-hmm. And they did so. Their first hypothesis was wrong, that it was all Noah's flood. But they looked, nevertheless, with that presupposition. Mm-hmm. And so geology was born.
Okay. Very good point. Basil, you've got your hand up. Comment?
Yeah, I do. Graham, I was thinking that the origins of what we call modern day science, so it's this idea of experimentation and that we can
Mm,
experiment in our world and learn something of our world. I mean, to me, obviously, the presuppositions that led to that were very strongly Christian. You can make an extremely strong historical case for that. But once that presupposition and that idea has been put out there, then you have to move into the reality that you don't have to be a Christian to do good science, right?
indeed.
And
True.
that is,
Absolutely.
I think, sort of the way, there's a difference between coming to that understanding and then carrying out the science. So it's been divulged. And the difference for me, if we look at the modern day carrying out of science, and I've read a lot also of Dawkins, for example, is that I am pretty sure that if you were to corner Dawkins into a debate, um, he would probably tend towards the idea that at some point humanity will probably be able to figure out most of the world's problems. It's kind of an underlying theme. I don't think he would love to say it, but it would probably come across as too arrogant for him to say that. But it comes across to me in his writings. And so then you have the distinction of a materialist who is looking at their own power, looking at their own talents, looking at their own giftings, and more powerfully understanding the world. Or you have a Christian who is doing science, who knows that there is this beautiful infinity of God behind all that has been made, and that there actually is no end to it. And I think from that point of view, because Dawkins has always said that he thinks being a Christian would impede doing good science. And that is, it's laughable. It's actually laughable because if you have this sense that God is behind it, there's actually no end to it. You just keep going and going and going. And you open one door, there's five behind that, there's another five
Mm.
behind that. So I just wanted to make that distinction between what happened historically and maybe the way we operate now, and then see what your thoughts were on that.
Yes. I think one a nuance perhaps which I would mention at this stage is that I would argue that it's the view of God rather than being a Christian. You can look at some of the great controversies in history in which it was Christian pitted against Christian. But I think the ones who made most contribution were those who had the most biblical worldview. As a Christian, I'm quite capable of holding on to all sorts of theologically suspect ideas. So there's nothing magical about being a Christian, but Galileo had really a very strongly biblical worldview. I think you can make that point, and that those who opposed him did so on non-biblical for non-biblical reasons. So we need to continually go back humbly. I think that's another thing that is a Christian's advantage. We know we are fallible. We know our weaknesses. I know I'm sinful. And with that understanding of myself, hopefully that will enable me to sit down before the facts like a child, which of course comes from Jesus and was then popularized by Francis Bacon and then was taken over by Thomas Henry Huxley. But the idea came from Jesus. We sit before the facts like a child. We cannot enter the kingdom of heaven with all our baggage. And we need to practice that. We need to learn that humility so that we can then address the world without bringing in our own baggage.
Okay.
But yes, I agree absolutely with you that science can now operate quite well, thank you, but we need to remember how it was given birth, why it is in fact a gift of God.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Good. Dal, you've got another comment. No, you got to unmute yourself. I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah. Had to relearn my computer since the last hour. I kind of reacting a little bit to one of Randy's initial questions and emphasize maybe that science isn't how we understand they train lawyers to be able to argue either side of a case. We really do think there's something true and not just arbitrary to be proved one way or another in something. You know, we've got more than just a Thomas Kuhn paradigm shift, that it's sociological, where the new funding is coming, not where the old funding was. And one thing I'm going to toss out is the importance that you're bringing out, that this is probably the wrong audience, because I think we all assume this and it's all part of us. But we're living in a postmodern age. There are many small t truths, but not one capital T truth. And it seems to me that science is still one part of that postmodern age in which something is true, not an arbitrary truth. You know, to probably quote or paraphrase Galileo, yes, it moves, if that's not apocryphal. But this is something that worries me with with some aspects of the contemporary church, is that science can be treated as an optional and not maybe the one last hold our society has on something that really is true, in contrast to an option that we can believe or not believe. There's no question there, and I guess I'm looking for responses, or just expressing myself.
Yeah, thank you, Dale. I do think we need to affirm, in fact, that all human knowledge is provisional. That there is, as Christians, truth is out there because it is known by God. We may never know that truth. Some things are less provisional than others, for example. You know, we've talked about Galileo, and we can be fairly certain now that the Earth moves around the sun. But increasingly, and I guess Basil and as a chemist would be able to say far more about this than I, you know, physicists and all the strange quantum world, increasingly the truth, as we get closer to the truth, it remains out of reach for us. So there is the sense that although God knows the truth, we may never know it in its entirety. Now, the world says, there, I told you that, there's no truth. But the scientific understanding is that there is a truth there to be discovered. And as John Polkinghorne said, we are gaining an ever tightening grasp of an ever unattainable reality, ever elusive reality. So we search for that truth, even though we may not find it. And that is not to allow for one moment of the dictums of postmodernism, that there is no truth.
Yeah, that's the phrase I was searching for, is something out there is true, whether or not anybody knows it.
Yeah.
Think
that
about
is known by God.
Think about the planets past Saturn for several millennia, for example. They were there, nobody knew it, but there is a truth out there.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. I'd like to get back to some of the earlier discussions about the importance of the recognition of God as creator in terms of being able to do science. But it seems to me that that's hardly sufficient, because what is more important, or just as important, or a secondary importance, I don't know, is how God sustains the universe. Because he may have created it, but it almost seems as if we have a contradiction within Christianity. Because on the one hand, we say God created it, and so we have consistency of existence and reality, and we can study it. But on the other, there's another dimension of biblical interpretation that says God answers prayer and he performs miracles, which is the opposite. which is saying no. If you carry it to its extreme, if God is constantly tweaking circumstances for each of us to respond to our particular needs, or if he's responding to everyone's prayers in terms of modifying nature to respond it, then you lose that consistency. So it isn't simply a matter of God exists and has created everything. It's really an understanding of is the world truly consistent or not, and to what extent is it? Because if God is constantly tweaking things around, then sometimes you can do science and sometimes you can't.
Good question.
So I think it's more than a biblical view. It depends upon how we interpret Scripture and to what extent we think God behaves in that way.
God is faithful. I mean, I think that's our bottom line, isn't it? God is faithful. If God is not faithful, then we cannot hope to deal with him. Then our faith is worth nothing.
True, but
So
we have
God
to
is
interpret
faithful.
what
Yeah.
it means for him to be
Yeah.
faithful.
So what about miracle? Well, my understanding of and I think people have used the wrong terminology, as if God suspends his laws. I don't think God can suspend his laws. After all, the laws of God are only his ways, his faithful ways, his consistent ways of upholding nature. But with the resurrection of Jesus, with the miracles of Jesus, God shows that there are deeper laws, deeper consistent than those with which we normally have to deal. So as Christians, we believe that God will create a new heavens and a new earth, which we cannot hope to understand. But at times, the physics, if you like, of that new heavens and new earth break through. And this is revealed in for example, the resurrection of Jesus, who was the first fruits. So the resurrection of Jesus is not the negation of current law. Current law holds true. Jesus was dead. His body was decaying. But beyond this world, God has purposed to invest his own life and energy in a new world where his consistency, his faithfulness is manifested in a new way. And therefore we look forward to that world without seeing a clash, but just recognizing that it is as yet beyond our ken, and that as yet God is going to do different things. How does God work within the faithfulness of natural law? I don't know, but we must allow him the option of answering prayer, of working without cancelling his faithful upholding of nature, of the matter he holds in existence, which is what creation is all about. It's a continual giving of being. So God's faithfulness is unchanging. But behind that, there are laws which he knows of, ways of working which he knows of. And so we need to be just humble about that and recognize that as long as we are looking at this creation, we expect it to be consistent.
Okay. Very good.
You know, I love that idea. If I can, Randy, do you mind if I
Go
jump
ahead.
in?
Go ahead.
I love that idea that you mentioned, Graeme, and I think it's a big misconception, particularly among people of faith, of this idea that science is suspended when we talk about miracles. And I think that, you know, for people who are involved in science, like for me, I've viewed exactly the way you described it. Like I see this circle, you know, that is expanding with time, that is, you know, the mind of man and everything that we know, but that it's surrounded by this greater infinite circle of God's knowledge. And so what we should do if a friend of ours is sick, it's entirely consistent, to come to your point, Randy. We should be praying for the best possible medical practitioners, because this is God's gift of the mind to those individuals. But it's at the same time consistent to pray out of the realm of our knowledge into what I would call God's science, and pray for that for our loved ones as well. And that actually it's a consistent prayer. And sometimes what I found in our churches is that we've separated that out. And some people will say, well, even some people like, well, medical science in some ways, that's kind of man's medicine, and we should be praying a little bit more for, miracles. But I think that you can come together, as exactly as you said, science is not suspended when we have, Graeme, I don't know. I'm just jumping in there, Randy. I hope that's okay. But
yes, I would come back to, the great Enlightenment philosopher, David Hume, who really spoke as if miracles, the resurrection, whatever, involves the suspension of natural laws. And I think he has set the parameters of the discussion following. But I certainly don't subscribe to what David Hume said. David Hume had never heard of the new creation.
mm-hmm.
And the new creation has got to have its own particular lawfulness. And what it is, I don't know. But in the resurrection, we see the soma pneumatica, the body which is inspired and controlled by the Holy Spirit of God. So this is something that is new, which God will yet unfold to us, which is coming out of his character of faithfulness and goodness.
Okay. I don't see any more raised hands. We're past the hour already, but I don't want to stop any discussion. Anyone else want to raise your hand and speak in any way? Any more questions? I think we're here. So, well, I want to thank you, Graeme, for writing a stimulating, thoughtful book, and trust this will bring to awareness a lot more of your book to a lot more people, and maybe you'll get a few more sales on it.
Well, I hope it has the effect of helping people to see the falsehood of the conflict hypothesis, which is so actively driven by people on, sadly, both sides of the story.
Mm-hmm.
There is only one satisfying worldview, and I believe it's the biblical one because it brings all things together. One final comment from me, perhaps, coming back to miracles and the working of God.
Please.
Come from C.S. Lewis's book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the great lion who represents Jesus comes back to life again.
Mm-hmm.
And the evil witch says, how can this be? Because I know the magic that goes back to the beginning of the world. And the lion says, well, I know the magic which goes back before the beginning of the world. So our own creation is just a very special and wonderful part of the reality which God holds in being.
Right. Good point. And that's a good way to summarize and close our session. And I thank you very much for joining us, Graeme. Okay,
thank you so much for all your comments and your helpfulness. And thank you to Basil and those questions which have come. I've been very honored. God bless you.
Farewell.